Welcome to Cause Before Symptom, uncovering the real cabal and spiritual forces that are controlling the world. And now, here is your host, James Carter.
Welcome to Cause Before Symptom. I'm your host, James Carter, and today is August 20th, 2026. And tonight's episode is called The Blood of the Covenant, when the sacrifice, the covenant, and the servant begin to converge. This is part of our 19 series, part 14, Why Did God Choose Blood? So last night, part 13, we moved the investigation from the altar into the human heart. We discovered that God promised something repeated animal sacrifice could never accomplish by itself. He would circumcise the heart, write his law within his people, cleanse them, give them a new heart and spirit, and ultimately place his own spirit within them. It's kind of a big deal. Jeremiah called this coming restoration a new covenant. And tonight asks why covenant and blood belong together. So at Mount Sinai, God did not demand that Israel earn its rescue. He had already delivered them from Egypt and told them that he had brought them to himself. He did this for him. Only afterward did he establish the covenant with the children of Israel. Now, this matters because covenant was more than just a contract or collection of commandments. God had rescued a people and was establishing how they would live in relationship with him. Then Exodus 24 places blood directly at the center of that relationship. Moses puts part of the sacrificial blood upon the altar, reads the covenant to the people, and then places blood upon them, declaring, "Behold, the blood of the covenant." Well, we already established that Scripture connects blood with life. So now the question becomes why life represented by blood appears when covenant relationship with God is established. Now, what happens next is remarkable as Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders ascend the mountain, encounter God's presence, and eat and drink before God. We should not force later New Testament meaning into the scene right now, but the sequence deserves careful attention. Blood, covenant, God's presence, and a meal appear together. And perhaps covenant was always about something much greater than a set of rules. Perhaps it was about life with God. Now, Israel eventually broke that covenant many times, and Jeremiah announces God's answer to that. God promises a new covenant in which his law will be written within his people. They will know him. Their iniquity will be forgiven, and their sin will be remembered no more. Well, last night already established the heart problem, so we do not need to prove it again. But tonight, instead, asks how the new covenant answers the failure of the old covenant. Then Isaiah gives us one of the most important pieces of the silhouette of Jesus that we have been building. See, God describes his servant as someone he will give for a covenant of a people. This is extraordinary because Isaiah also describes the servant as righteous, suffering, bearing sin, associated with the guilt offering, and pouring out his life unto death. The servant connected with sacrifice is now also connected with covenant. We are still not going to name the worker, even though I've done it many times, but instead we are allowing the Old Testament to construct his silhouette. So we're doing this correctly. Someone is coming who is righteous, bears all sin, gives his life, is associated with sacrifice, and is somehow connected with covenant. And meanwhile, Jeremiah promises that the coming covenant will bring forgiveness and reach the human heart. Wow. So a few nights from parts 12, 13, and tonight, part 14, are therefore beginning to converge together As part 12 showed us the life being given through the servant, part 13 showed us the life God intends to restore within his people, and part 14 tonight asks whether the covenant is the bridge connecting those two realities. Now, the question is becoming larger than why God chose blood now, because we are beginning to ask what God intended to accomplish through the blood. If covenant is ultimately about restored relationship with the God from whom life comes, then blood, sacrifice, forgiveness, transformation, and God's presence may all be pieces of the same story. The worker has still not been named, but his silhouette is becoming difficult to miss. The blood trail is bringing sacrifice, covenant, and the mysterious servant into the same picture, and we are getting closer to understanding how the life that is given could become the road toward the life God intends to restore. It's going to be a great show. I'm looking forward to it. Shout out to everybody on the live chat rumble. Number 1 warrior is Scorpion. Scorpion says, hey, Pastor and Warrior family, glad to be back with you all tonight. Scorpion, it's great to have you here, my friend. God bless you. Number 2 warrior is Boots, the half man, half nerd. Boots, the man in the cave, the guy in the powder room, the man sparking a spleefer. Boots Hafner says, hello, Pastor James and Warrior family. Thank you all for your prayers. And let's all hit that thumbs up button to boost these shows up on Rumble. Thank you. Yeah, if you could do that, that'd be great. But first, guys, pray for Boots' wife. She did suffer a stroke a couple months ago. She's recovering slowly but surely. She's going to get healed all the way, but she still needs your prayers for her to heal faster. Even though she's going to be just fine, your prayers still help. Thank you so much for praying for Boots. And Boots does remind us, yeah, hey, guys, Rumble only judges me based on how many likes I get. And I hate to, manipulate the scene here, but unfortunately, I even do it. I forget to even hit the like button. So I understand why it's not easy to hit the like button. And I'm not going to manipulate it by telling you do it or else. But what I am going to say is, if you do really like the show, follow me, take your thumb, go down to your phone, hit the X button, and then hit thumbs up, and then go to live chat. You won't lose your spot, I promise. Thank you so much, Boots, for the reminder. We love you, buddy, and we love your wife. Next warrior is third in line. It's Robert Gerdison, the man who flies all around the world. He says, hey, y'all, love y'all neighbors. Every lesson learned seems to point to this. Amen, amen, amen. Thank you, Robert Gerdison. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point of life. If you want to know your purpose is to help people. That's it. And helping your people, you can't do it unless you love them. Otherwise, you're living a selfish life. Number 4 warrior is Philip Del Piano. He says, good evening, everyone. Hello, Scorpion. Hello, Boots. And my favorite, Pastor James Carner. Thank you. And he says, hello, Robert Gerdison. Amen, guys. The gang's all here. God bless you. Thank you. And let's get straight into breaking news.
Welcome to Shitty Breaking News with your host, James Carner, offering his shitty opinion.
California lawmaker Aisha Wahab wins special election to succeed Eric Swalwell in their little primaries. Well, California is mainly controlled by China, believe it or not. The ports, the leaders, they all like and want communism because China is communist, even though they're kind of socialist, capitalist, communist, kind of like a mix between all of them. But China does have a huge pull in blue states, mostly the states with ports. Ports is everything when it comes to making money, especially when you don't want to pay tariffs. Well, California can always just turn a cheek on some of the goods that comes in through their ports and say, F you to the Fed. So California is never going to be red, okay? Unless the people literally get up and go vote red. But here's the deal. Even if they vote red, it's just voting for another disgusting dynasty. They're all wicked and evil, and they're all going to bring the country down regardless. So stop worrying about it. It's not your responsibility to change America. It's the Americans. And you can only love your neighbor, read your Bible, and vote. And that's all you can do. And if you think you can change the world from the top down, you're selling yourself a bag of goods, a lie, a bridge, a straw bridge. And I'm telling you, it's not going to bring you any comfort listening to the news and following what they want you to know. But we're doing it right now. Bassett says U.S. to impose toughest ever sanctions on Iran, urges China to do something. Well, Bassett just pumped in, I don't know, I think it was like $9 billion into U.S. bonds. So we basically we purchased a bunch of our own bonds, okay? And he thought that that would help the economy. And sure enough, the economy still is rising inflation. So no, it didn't help. So he's like, we got to sanction China more. And Iran. Well, hey, the economy is very delicate. And it's going to take someone better than Trump now to change that around. Trump had his chance during his first election, but he pussied out. If he would have been smart, he would have went straight up to the Federal Reserve and said, you're fired. Got rid of the Federal Reserve. And then started printing our own money for the people, by the people. Because the Federal Reserve is 12 banks that are owned by corporations, bankers, not federal government, that's been running the world's economy because 60% of the entire world uses the US dollar. If Trump was smart, he would have done that, but he did not. He promised he was going to, and he still hasn't done it. And that's why I don't like Trump, because he wailed at the Wailing Wall, supporting the Zionist state that has killed hundreds of thousands of women, children, and senior citizens in Gaza. Now, I love and support the Israeli people, but I don't love and support the Israeli leadership and the state because they are genocidal, wicked, and sick, trying to rush in their Messiah just because Bibi Netanyahu was prophesied over by a rabbi, Talmudic rabbi, that he was going to be the one that hands the spear of Longinus to the Messiah. Well, I don't see it coming. I think we're way far off. It's just not happening right now. Navy discusses renaming aircraft carrier after Trump instead of heroic black sailor. Oh my God. Man, really? You're going to do that? You're going to really bring in race and Trump involved in naming a ship? Why can't you just name the ship A or B or C or Z? Don't name it after people. But no, they got to name it. They got to bring this one in because, that's going to really make people talk and stop the world from watching the bankers steal your money and the insurance companies. Psychopathy in stereo as former Trump hater Michael Cohen loses his nerve. I don't care. Michael Cohen was his attorney. They were buddies at one time. Michael Cohen decided that Trump wasn't holding his end of the bargain, and then he tattled on him. That's all I know. Aircraft carrier arrives in Middle East to relieve USS Abraham Lincoln after it's been sitting there for since the beginning. They need food, they need water, they need to dump their black tank, meaning all the shit that they've been building up. Yeah, it's time. They need to restock and reclean and come back in. That's what happens. White House faces questions over security clearance for top Trump aide Natalie Harp. Who cares and who gives a shit? None of this is helping your pocket. None of this is making you more money. All of this is robbing you blind. And that's breaking news. When we come back, we're going to do part 14 of why God chose blood. Did God rescue Israel before he asked Israel to obey? Well, find out if you stick around.
Every year, millions of Americans sign a contract they don't even know exists. They think it's just another tax return, but that signature means something far deeper. It starts with that first job at 16. The system takes a piece of her check, then promises to give some back if she signs the return. Every April 15th, the same cycle repeats, not by law, but by belief. The system didn't bind them, their own signature did. Learn the truth at unincorporatedassociations.com.
Back to the show. Investigation asks, did God rescue Israel before he asks Israel to obey? Well, before examining the blood of the covenant, we need to establish the order of events. Israel did not arrive at Sinai trying to earn God's rescue. God had already heard their cries in Egypt, confronted Pharaoh, brought the plagues, provided the Passover, led Israel through the sea, and carried them into the wilderness. The covenant at Mount Sinai comes after the rescue, not before it. Keep that in mind. So that order changes how we understand the law. God did not tell enslaved Israel that if they perfectly obeyed his commandments, he might rescue them. He rescued them first. That's huge. Then he brought them to Mount Sinai and explained what life in covenant relationship with him would require. Exodus 19:4 makes this especially clear. God reminds Israel what he had already done and says he carried them on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. Notice the destination. God does not merely say he brought them out of Egypt. He says he brought them to himself because he wanted to be near him. Philip says, you can make a career on the shitty news, James. Love the report. Seriously? I guess when I do the breaking shitty news, I'm so conscious about my, full global view that I don't think I have like enough information. But I mean, if I spent like a couple days doing that, or at least like all day going through the news and then do a news report, sure. And I would probably grow more than just 10 people watching me at night. Or 300 people watching my videos together, because that's all I get when I talk about Jesus. But, it's just, that's not my calling. My calling is to throw in a little conspiracy theory, debunking them or showing them that they're real, and talking about the families that we've done. We've done the 13 Black nobilities. We've done the 13 illuminated families. And it's just weird. It's weird. It just doesn't feel like my calling, but you never know. If it goes to that, I'll be like, okay, well. Boot says, doesn't sound right about Americans' aircraft carriers going through that, because we always get replenished from supply ships. They're always going back and forth to the fleet. Well, I believe it got hit enough times where it needed to get repairs as well, Boots. There's been attacks on us that we don't know, and they're not going to report that in America. God forbid one of our ships get hit by some, boat drone, which, we've got all this advanced stuff, but I don't know. Robert Gerson says the shitty news would go viral. Well, I know, but it's not what I'm doing right now, but I'll think about it. So God brought them on eagle's wings to himself. So God doesn't merely say he brought them out of Egypt. He says he brought them to himself. And that may tell us something important about the Exodus. Freedom from Pharaoh was not the final destination. Oh, and by the way, they didn't have it that bad in Israel. Okay, they towards the end, then they had to really start doing some real work, because they were pissing off Pharaoh because they were buying up the land. They had their own currency, they had their own market, they had socialism, and they were literally Pharaoh was paying for their housing and paying wages for their work. And then all of that came to an end. And so it wasn't like Israel was suffering for thousands of years under Pharaoh. No. So Exodus 19:5-6 says that if Israel will obey his voice and keep his covenant, they will be his peculiar treasure. Peculiar. A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You'll be my peculiar treasure. That's an interesting choice of words. Rescue has already occurred, folks. He rescued them without them having to do a thing. They prayed, he came. Took them longer than they wanted, but hey, he has to move mountains. And moving mountains is moving people. Moving people is working with people who listen to you. And that's not easy. God's initiative does not eliminate human responsibility. He delivers them, but they are still called to listen, obey, and remain faithful. Now, this also keeps us from reducing covenant to a business contract. See, the language surrounding Mount Sinai is relational. God reminds Israel what he has done, calls them his treasured possession, and gives them a purpose among the nations. Well, the commandments describe how this rescued people should live with the God who rescued them. And it wasn't hard. It's just don't steal, don't kill, don't destroy to gain. Just love your neighbor. Stop wanting what they have. Just be happy with what you have. But that didn't work. So obedience, therefore, was not the purchase price of the Exodus. Israel could never claim that God rescued them because they had already demonstrated perfect covenant faithfulness. God acted first. That's important. Yet obedience did not come irrelevant after their rescue. The people who had been delivered were now responsible for how they lived with their deliverer. And this becomes important for our blood investigation because sacrifice can easily be misunderstood as a transaction. Sin happens, yes. Blood is offered, sure. And God supposedly forgives because the required price has been paid. But Mount Sinai begins in another direction. God is already moving toward his people before the covenant blood of Exodus 24 ever appears. God has already rescued them, brought them to himself, and offered them covenant relationship before the blood ceremony occurred. Therefore, the blood of Exodus 24 cannot simply mean that Israel was purchasing God's willingness to save them. Their deliverance from Egypt had already happened. And whatever the covenant blood means, it belongs within a relationship God has already initiated. I keep looking over because I've got this spider running around, and it's every time I see it, then it's there, and then I turn around, it's gone, then I see it, and it's over here, then it's gone, and it freaks me out. Like it's going to crawl all the way across and maybe up to my, I don't know. I'm not a spider fan. So Israel's response also matters here. In Exodus 19:8, the people agree to what God has promised and what God has proposed. He said, here's the rules. Can you do it? They say, we will do it. Well, this connects with what we established in part 13 without needing to reopen that investigation that last night, what we covered. So God's initiative and human response appear together. God acts and humanity responds. God establishes the relationship, but covenant faithfulness remains meaningful. So the tragedy is that Israel will eventually break what they promised to keep many times. Scorpion says, get the vacuum. The vacuum's in the garage. I keep forgetting to bring it in here. But yeah, I need to get my vacuum back because I got one that's in this little corner right here and that other one's running all around. And I just haven't been tidying up the man cave for reasons I don't know. I've just been doing other things. So the tragedy is that Israel will eventually break what they promised to keep. And Jeremiah will later use that failure when announcing the new covenant. But before we reach Israel's failure, something extraordinary happens. God formalizes the covenant with blood. Exodus 24 gives us an altar, sacrifices, the words of the covenant, Israel's agreement, and blood. Moses then calls it the blood of the covenant. Blood, therefore, appears after deliverance, but at the formal establishment of covenant relationship. Now, I know you guys go, man, a lot of this just sounds like you already talked about this. Yeah, I did, but you have to get it in your thick skulls, okay? You have to. We need to repeat and repeat again until you know it and you have it memorized. Otherwise, what's the point of listening to a hick from Oregon like me who finds things in the Bible that nobody else has found? Well, we have got to repeat. So that distinction here is crucial, as blood is not convincing God to rescue Israel. God has already done that. He did that first before all this crap started to happen. Blood enters the story when the rescued people are being bound to the God who rescued them. Now, something that we established much earlier in this series becomes important again. Scripture connects blood with life. We do not need to prove that again. We can see and use it as evidence already established and ask a new question. Why does something representing life appear at the moment covenant relationship is established? Why does life just appear after the blood is atoned? Well, the question becomes even more interesting because of what happens immediately afterward. Representatives of Israel, remember the 70 that rose to the mount, ascended to the mountain? And remember a couple of them, they're Abihu and Adab. Remember those two? They ended up dying for providing the wrong spices when they were offering to the covenant. They died. So they send their representatives of Israel to ascend the mountain. They encounter God's presence and eat and drink before God. So the sequence of Exodus 19:24 is remarkable. God rescues Israel, brings them to himself, establishes covenant, blood appears, and then representatives of Israel enter his presence. So we should not explain that sequence before investigating it. For now, we simply recognize that it exists. Covenant appears to be about much more than just rules. The entire movement is toward relationship with God. And that gives us our foundation for tonight. God did not rescue Israel because Israel first proved itself worthy through obedience to God. No, they weren't. In fact, when they were living in Egypt, they were practicing witchcraft, and they were mixing it with a little bit of Abrahamism. So God acted first and brought them to himself. And once rescued, however, they were called to respond and live faithfully within the relationship that he established, meaning stop doing witchcraft, stop casting spells on people, stop robbing and stealing and killing and destroying just for your personal gain. And they were doing it against themselves. And now we can approach Exodus 24 with the right question. Why did the God who had already rescued Israel choose blood when he formally joined them to himself in covenant? Why blood? Well, this takes us directly into the mystery because Moses does something remarkable with the blood. Remember, he sprinkles them. Some goes toward the altar and some goes toward the people. Now, if we want to understand why God chose blood, we need to understand why covenant blood appears on both sides of the relationship. So why did Moses put blood on both the altar and the people? Well, we arrive here at one of the most unusual covenant ceremonies in the Old Testament. Because by the time you get up here, if you're reading this blind without knowing anything about the Bible, you're going to be like, this is weird, man. This God does sound satanic, but he's not. Exodus 24 describes Moses building an altar at Mount Sinai and setting up 12 pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Young men then offer burnt offerings and peace offerings, and Moses collects the blood, then he divides it. Exodus 24:6 says Moses places half of the blood upon the altar while keeping the other half in basins. Remember, to go into the sanctuary. He reads the book of the covenant to Israel, and the people respond that everything the Lord has spoken that they will do and obey. Moses then takes the remaining blood that were in the basins, okay? Takes the remaining blood, sprinkles that upon the people. Who knows how long they've been sitting in those jars? Sprinkles them on the people and declares, behold, the blood of the covenant, which the Lord hath made with you concerning all of these words. So the arrangement appears deliberate here. There is an altar, 12 pillars representing Israel, sacrifices, God's covenant words, Israel's agreement, and blood associated with them, with both the altar and the people. So Exodus does not tell us that God and Israel are literally sharing blood, so we should not claim that. But the same sacrificial blood clearly stands at the center of the covenant relationship between, or being formally established by them. So Moses specifically calls it the blood of the covenant. And that means the blood is not incidental to the ceremony. It ratifies or solemnizes the relationship God is establishing with Israel. We already established earlier that the series in Leviticus 17:11, it connects blood with life. So we don't need to prove that again and again and again. But instead, we can ask why something representing life appears at the moment God establishes covenant with his people. So one possibility is that the blood demonstrates the life and blood seriousness of covenant. Covenant with God is not a casual agreement that can be abandoned without consequence. It means if you're putting blood in between us, remember, have you ever heard, remember the Native Americans, they would, from what we understand, they would cut their hands and shake with their neighbors, and they would make a blood covenant with them as they cut themselves. Well, to the Native Americans, that was an agreement so that they wouldn't war against each other. And they took it seriously. Well, this is kind of like the same thing. Covenant with God is not a casual agreement. You can't just abandon it without consequences. And Genesis 15 already gives us a covenant imagery involving divided animals, while Jeremiah 34 later describes covenant breakers in connection with a calf that had been cut in two. Covenant could carry the solemn reality that violating the relationship brought judgment. And they knew this because Moses read them the covenant agreement, and they all said, sure, we'll do that. But that does not seem to explain everything happening in Exodus 24. The blood is not merely displayed as a warning about future punishment. It's applied within the ceremony. Some goes toward the altar and some goes upon the people. Moses then directly identifies that blood with the covenant God has made with them. The blood appears to be doing more than illustrating what might happen if Israel disobeys. It participates in formally establishing the relationship itself. So the sacrifices involved are also interesting, as Exodus mentions burnt offerings and peace offerings. Peace offerings could involve fellowship and eating in connection with sacrifice. Eating, fellowship. Immediately after the covenant ceremony, Moses and Israel's elders ascend the mountain and eat and drink before God. So we shouldn't force later theology backwards into Exodus, but we should notice the sequence here. Sacrifice leads to covenant blood. Covenant blood leads towards God's presence. And God's presence is followed by a meal. This is why we ended up eating Jesus' body and drinking his blood. Symbolically. So the covenant words and the blood also belong together. Israel first hears what God has spoken and agrees to obey. Only then does Moses apply the blood and call it the blood of the covenant. This is not an undefined spiritual relationship. God has spoken, Israel responded, and blood solemnized the relationship. So covenant, therefore, contains both relationship and a responsibility. And that becomes important when we remember Jeremiah's promise of a new covenant. Last night, we established what Jeremiah says will change. So we don't need to investigate the heart again here. The heart was going to change. What matters now is that Jeremiah deliberately calls the coming relationship a new covenant. New. So the first covenant had God's words, blood, and a people entering relationship with him, yet that covenant was eventually broken. Jeremiah says another covenant is coming. So this also strengthens the silhouette that we have been following, silhouette of Jesus Christ. If the first covenant was established with blood, what will happen when God establishes the covenant Jeremiah promised? We should not answer that from the New Testament just yet. The Old Testament still has evidence to show us still, particularly Isaiah's mysterious servant who is somehow connected with covenant while also giving his life. And remember, throughout all of this, God rescued them first. They didn't have to obey or be good. He answered their call, rescued him first before they'd even started a covenant. Don't forget that. So earlier we established something that we also can't forget, that God had already rescued Israel before the covenant blood appeared. That's what I just said. I'm just repeating myself. The blood, therefore, was not Israel purchasing God's love for convincing him to deliver them. God had already brought them out of Egypt and told them that he had brought them to himself. So the covenant ceremony occurs inside a relationship initiated by God. Remember that. Then Exodus gives us the final detail that may change how we understand the entire ceremony. After Moses declares the blood of the covenant, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders ascend upon the mountain, Mount Sinai. And Exodus says they see the God of Israel, yet God does not destroy them. Instead, they eat and drink in his presence. And 2 of them end up dying for breaking the law. So the story, therefore, does not end with blood upon the people. The story doesn't end with blood upon the people. It ends with the people alive in the presence of God. So the animals have died, blood has established the covenant, and human beings move toward fellowship with God. Death appears in the ceremony, but death is not where the ceremony leads. And that may be another piece of the pattern that we have been discovering throughout this series. Blood involves death because life has been given in exchange for their sins. But the destination keeps moving beyond death toward relationship with the living God. So now we're going to examine that extraordinary meal because Exodus deliberately places blood, covenant, God's presence, and fellowship beside one another. And we need to discover why. Because remember, Jesus is going to say, hey, this is my blood, drink it. And this is my body, eat it. And it's a thing going on now. TikTok, people are saying that God of the old covenant is evil. Well, this whole series has proven that God actually brought them out of Egypt before asking for anything. And then said, hey, I'm trying to draw closer to you, but if you want to draw close to me, then these are the things you need to do, because I'm sure that there's something that has to do with blood, life, and plasma that breaks or gets God closer from the fourth dimension to the third dimension. Can't explain it, but my buddy Josh Urban has a theory on that. So why did they eat and drink in the presence of God? Well, immediately after Moses declares, behold, the blood of the covenant, Exodus 24 does something unexpected. The story does not move directly into another commandment or another sacrifice. Instead, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, two of those which died providing false incense, and 70 elders of Israel ascend to the mountain. And what happens next may be one of the most overlooked scenes in the covenant story. Exodus 24:10 says, and they saw the God of Israel. Well, the passage describes what appeared beneath his feet as something like a paved work of sapphire, clear as the heavens. So whatever precisely these men were permitted to see, the text wants us to understand that representatives of Israel had entered into an extraordinary encounter with God's presence. We're talking supernatural. When Exodus gives us an even more remarkable detail, verse 11 says, God did not lay his hand upon the nobles of Israel, and instead they saw God and did eat and drink. Well, this is how the covenant ceremony concludes. Immediately before this moment, there had been sacrifices, blood, covenant words, Israel's agreement to obey, and Moses' declaration of the blood of the covenant. Now representatives of the people are eating and drinking before God, supernaturally, around sapphires. The sequence deserves our attention because God had already told Israel in Exodus 19 that he had brought them to himself. He initiated it first. Israel then agrees to the covenant. Sacrifices are offered. Blood is placed upon the altar, and the people and representatives of Israel ascend into God's presence. So the movement that began with deliverance from Egypt has ended, at least in this scene, with fellowship before God. Now, we need to be careful about the passage and what it actually proves. Exodus does not explicitly say that the blood caused these men to survive God's presence. No. So we should not make that claim here. It also does not identify this meal with communion or the Last Supper. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say, this is a representative of Jesus. No. Those connections can be tested much later when we finally allow the New Testament to identify the worker. But for now, the Old Testament is seen as powerful enough on its own. And what we can say is that the covenant ceremony ends with fellowship rather than death. Animals have died, blood has been shed, and yet the covenant representatives remained alive while they're with God, eating food. And God's like, here, try this macaroni salad. I mean, it's awesome. Oh my God. Oh, have you had my cottage cheese, Peach? Oh. For now, the Old Testament scene is powerful enough. So what can we say? What we can say is that the covenant ceremony ends with fellowship rather than death. Animals have died, blood has been shed, and yet covenant representatives remain alive. Their movement is not away from God, but toward him. So the final picture is not people hiding from God's presence. Not the final picture. It is people eating and drinking before God. 73 people. 74. That may help us understand what covenant was ultimately intended to accomplish. The commandments mattered, obedience mattered, and covenant faithfulness mattered. But Exodus repeatedly frames these things within relationship. God rescued Israel and brought them to himself. Now representatives of that rescued people are pictured in his presence. Covenant, therefore, appears to involve much more than agreeing to rules. So meals also carried powerful relational meaning in the biblical world. Eating together could express fellowship, peace, acceptance, and relationship. The two angels that visited Abraham sat and ate a meal with Abraham. Exodus 24 had already mentioned peace offerings, which elsewhere could include eating portions of the sacrifice. So we shouldn't assume that every detail of the mountain meal comes directly from those offerings, because the passage does not explicitly say so. But the proximity of sacrifice, covenant, presence, and eating deserves attention. So this becomes especially important to our blood investigation. If blood were simply evidence that God desired death, the direction of Exodus 24 would be difficult to explain. Animals die, but the people live. Blood is shed, but the people approach God. Death occurs within the covenant ceremony, but the story moves through that depth and death toward living fellowship in God's presence. So that pattern should sound familiar by now. Throughout this investigation, blood has continually been connected with life. Sacrifice involves death, but atonement and cleansing have repeatedly been connected with preserving or restoring relationship with God. Death appears along the road, but the destination keeps moving toward life with him. So the covenant, therefore, may help us understand something even deeper about God's commandments as well. They were not arbitrary restrictions imposed by a distant ruler. They described how a people involved, living in covenant with the holy God, were supposed to live. So Israel had been removed from Pharaoh's rule and brought to God. And now they had to learn what faithfulness within that relationship looked like. And it wasn't that big of a deal. You just had to be better than who you were. You had to work on yourself. It wasn't about earning anything. It was just about being a good person, because God's good. How hard is it for us to be good? So that also explains why breaking covenant would become so serious, as Israel would not merely be violating a legal document. They would be violating a relationship, as idolatry, injustice, bloodshed, exploitation, and rebellion contradicted the identity of a people whom God had rescued, brought to himself, and called his own. So you could take out the angry God and put that one away. This is where Jeremiah's promised new covenant begins looming over the story. The people who stood beneath the blood of the covenant and promised obedience would eventually break that covenant. Yet God would not abandon his desire for relationship with him. Instead, he would promise another covenant in which something fundamental would change within the people themselves. So Exodus 24, therefore, leaves us with an image that we need to remember as the silhouette continues developing. Jesus Christ. Blood and covenant appear together, and immediately afterward, human beings enter God's presence and share a meal. Also, I want to mention, when people say that the God of the Old Testament is the devil, is Lucifer himself, why would Jesus quote Lucifer's words? Why would Jesus even go with any of the talk about King David, or talk about Solomon, or talk about any of the people? Why would he talk about Abraham? Why would he talk about all of those who followed that God? That wouldn't make any sense. So don't fall for that, okay? If these same elements, blood covenant, if they appear together again later in Scripture, then we will know that the pattern did not begin there. Its outline was already visible at Mount Sinai, Jesus, the silhouette. And that brings us directly to our next investigation, as Israel had experienced deliverance, heard God's word, agreed to obey, received the blood of the covenant, and even had representatives eat and drink before God. Yet the covenant would still be broken. So the question now is not whether the covenant ceremony was powerful enough, but whether covenant blood could change the people who received it deeply enough to keep them faithful. Remember, it was about the heart. Well, that distinction may finally explain why God eventually promised a new covenant, because we just couldn't keep it. So Israel had now experienced something extraordinary. God rescued them from Egypt, brought them to himself, spoke his covenant words, received their agreement, and established a relationship with blood. Representatives of Israel then ascended the mountain, encountered God's presence, and ate and drank before him. If any generation would have understood the seriousness of covenant, it would seem like it would be this one, wouldn't it? Yet something shocking happens almost immediately. While Moses remains on the mountain with God, this is only 2 months after. The 70 elders, Nadab and Abihu, they left too. Moses remained. And 2 months later, they created a golden calf. So Exodus 32 tells us that the people became impatient. Only 2 months, 60 days. They gather around Aaron and demand gods who will go before them. Aaron makes the golden calf, and Israel begins worshiping it. Right away, right when they all make the covenant, go up and eat with God, God seems pleased, and they're like, F you. So the people who had just declared that everything the Lord commanded they would do are already violating the covenant that they promised to keep. That's wickedness. And the timing is what makes this so important, as Israel did not slowly forget the covenant over hundreds of years before rebellion appeared. No. The failure began almost immediately. They had witnessed Egypt's destruction, crossed the sea, heard God's voice, received the covenant, and seen the mountain covered with God's presence. None of those external experiences guaranteed continued faithfulness. So this tells us something important about the covenant blood. The blood of Exodus 24 could establish the covenant according to the purpose God gave it. But receiving that blood did not make Israel incapable of rebellion. The blood was upon the people, yet their hearts could still turn toward another God quickly, within 60 days. That distinction may be one of the most important discoveries in part 14. This is why we don't make converts. We should make disciples, because a convert can turn around on God. This is why we don't just go out and say, once saved, always saved. Just save as many people as you can. Oh, everyone's saved. That just doesn't seem to work when we look at how the Father is and what he's trying to accomplish. Don't shout me down for preaching good. The problem was not that the covenant lacked seriousness. Blood demonstrated its seriousness. The problem was that Israel lacked evidence of God. It wasn't that wasn't the problem either. The problem was not that Israel lacked evidence of God, and they had witnessed extraordinary evidence, have they not? The problem was not that they lacked commandments. God had spoken directly to them. Something inside the people could still resist everything they had experienced outside themselves. So we've already investigated the heart problem last night, but there's no reason to prove that again. But what matters now is what it means for covenant, the heart. A covenant can tell people that what faithfulness requires, but words alone do not guarantee that the people hearing them will remain faithful. Israel could say with their mouths that they would obey and shortly afterward act against what they had promised. So this becomes a pattern throughout Israel's history. The people turn away, experience consequences, cry out, return, and eventually wander again. Who did it? It wasn't God, the angry God of the Old Testament. No. The sacrificial system continues functioning, priests continue serving, and the covenant commandments remain available, yet possession of those things does not permanently solve the problem of covenant unfaithfulness. So the prophets eventually confront something even more disturbing, as religious activity itself could continue while covenant faithfulness disappeared. People could bring sacrifices while practicing injustice, a loophole. They could observe sacred rituals while oppressing others. They could assume that possessing God's temple meant that they remained secure while their behavior contradicted the God whose temple that they claimed. Jeremiah attacks exactly this kind of confidence. In Jeremiah 7, people come to the temple while stealing, murdering, committing adultery, swearing falsely, and following other gods like Baal and Moloch. They then stand before God in the house, bearing his name as though the religious institution protected them from the consequences of their behavior. No. Jeremiah exposes the deception because covenant relationship could not be reduced to participation in religious rituals. So this connects with what we discovered earlier concerning the possibility of using the sacrificial system to one's advantage. Wealth might make it easier to bring offerings, but wealth could not purchase permission to continue deliberately hurting others. God's provision for sacrifice was never intended to become a system through which someone could afford more sin. So the prophets repeatedly make that point, and Isaiah condemns worship offered alongside injustice. Hosea declares that God desires mercy and knowledge of him rather than sacrifices. Micah asks whether thousands of rams of rivers of oil could satisfy God, and then points toward justice, mercy, and humble walking with him. So the quantity of religious activity could never compensate for a heart determined to remain unfaithful. So that means that the failure of the covenant cannot simply be blamed on insufficient sacrifice. Israel did not need more animals. They already had sacrifices. They did not need more religious activity. They had religious activity. They did not merely need more commandments because they already possessed God's law. So the problem, guys, was deeper than just the system surrounding them. This is where Jeremiah 31 becomes extraordinary. God looks back at the covenant made when he brought Israel out of Egypt and explicitly says that his people broke it. Then he announces that the days are coming when he will make a new covenant. God's response to covenant failure is not simply to repeat Sinai with more blood, more commandments, or more severe punishments or penalties. Something fundamentally will change. And Jeremiah says God will put his law within his people and write it upon their hearts. So we already explored the heart in part 13, but the important point here is covenantal. The covenant that was heard externally and repeatedly broken will be followed by a covenant in which God's instructions somehow become internal. So that tells us that the old covenant's failure does not mean God's law was evil. Jeremiah does not say that God will throw his law away. God says that he will write it somewhere different. You know what this does? This throws the whole once saved, always saved thing out the door. The problem was never that righteousness was wrong. The problem was that human beings could know what was right and still choose against it. So this brings us to an important distinction here, folks. The covenant was established by God, but it involved human participation. Israel could therefore break the relationship. God's faithfulness did not automatically make Israel faithful. The golden calf proves how quickly people could turn away even after extraordinary encounters with God. Yet God does not respond by abandoning his desire for covenant relationship. He promises another covenant. And now the silhouette here begins sharpening again. You know, Jesus is written in the details here because Jeremiah leaves us with a mystery until the New Testament where we can go back and go, oh my God. If the first covenant involved blood, sacrifice, God's words, and Israel's agreement, what will establish the new covenant? If the people reach deeper than external obedience, what kind of covenant could actually reach the place where the old covenant continually broke down? So the answer begins appearing somewhere unexpected. Isaiah speaks about a mysterious servant whom God says he will give for a covenant of the people. Well, this is the same prophetic servant whose life becomes connected with suffering, bearing sin, and offering. Wow, everything that Jesus did. And the Pharisees at the time, apparently they didn't study their Bibles because it talks about Jesus right here. Well, let me put you this way. They knew it was the Messiah, but they had a good thing going, folks. Okay? They knew, but they had a good thing going. Why bring in when all of this sacrificial stuff works for those synagogues of Satan? They knew. So don't think that the Pharisees and Sadducees were blind to who God sent because they didn't want that God. They never did because they keep breaking the covenant over and over and over. And this is proof that God continues to give a new covenant to bring them back, trying everything he possibly can to get them to stop hurting their neighbor. So the old covenant was broken by the people who entered it, while the promised covenant somehow begins moving toward a person whom God himself will provide. So that's where our investigation goes next, because the silhouette is about to gain another unmistakable feature. The coming servant is not merely going to talk about covenant. Somehow he is going to become central to it. Now something happens that should make us stop and look carefully at the silhouette forming in the Old Testament. Jeremiah has told us that Israel broke the covenant established at Sinai and that God intends to make a new covenant. Now, if we were reading the story for the first time, we might expect God simply to announce another set of covenant terms or another ceremony. But instead, Isaiah introduces a mysterious servant and uses covenant language in connection with the servant himself. Isaiah 42:6 records God speaking to the servant, I, the Lord, have called thee in righteousness and will hold thine hand and will keep thee and will give thee for a covenant of the people, for a light of the Gentiles. That's in Isaiah. You think that the Sadducees and Pharisees didn't know Isaiah 42:6? Well, that wording is unusual. God does not merely say that the servant will teach the covenant, announce the covenant, or deliver another book of commandments. God says he will give the servant for a covenant of the people. So Isaiah 49:8 gives us the language again. God tells the servant that he will preserve him and give thee for a covenant of the people. The repetition matters because it makes it difficult to dismiss Isaiah 42 as an isolated phrase. Twice Isaiah describes this servant as someone God himself gives in connection with covenant. So we need to be cautious about what that means. Isaiah does not stop and provide a systematic explanation saying exactly how a person can be a covenant. The servant may function as the one through whom covenant restoration is accomplished or embodied. But whatever the precise meaning is, the text gives the servant a role much greater than merely delivering information about a future covenant. Period. So now place that besides what we've discovered in our earlier investigation, as Israel had covenant words, Israel had blood, sacrifice, priests, and eventually a temple. Yet Israel broke the covenant. Jeremiah's answer was a new covenant, while Isaiah's prophecy introduces a servant who's God in covenant language, whom God gives in covenant language. So something in the future covenant appears to be moving away from dependence upon another external arrangement and toward a person, a Messiah. And guess what? Many people knew this. Many people read their Bibles, and they saw Jesus come, and they actually brought him gifts. Many people knew that that was Jesus in the synagogues studying, because they read their Bibles and they understood Isaiah. But not Rome, not the Pharisees and Sadducees. They knew exactly what was going on, but they chose to ignore it because it would change the status quo. They wouldn't make any money. There's no money on Jesus. You can't profit. Jesus is not a capitalist. All he's interested in is loving you. And this becomes much more significant when we remember that what Isaiah says elsewhere about the servant. Isaiah 52:53 describes someone who suffers despite being presented as innocent. He's wounded in connection with the transgressions of others, bears their iniquities, is compared with the lamb led to slaughter, becomes associated with the asham, or guilt offering, and pours out his life unto death. Well, we investigated that evidence earlier, and we knew that that was Jesus, regardless if we knew anything about the New Testament or not. We knew it was a person. We don't need to prove that again. What matters now is that the new connection is here. The servant associated with sacrifice is also the servant associated with covenant. Two rails that we have been following separately are now beginning to move toward the same figure. And this is exactly why we have been looking for the work before identifying the worker. If we began by saying Jesus is the answer and searched backwards, well, it would be easy to see only what we expected to see, but instead, we had allowed the Old Testament to build the requirements one piece at a time. That's why I would say, but we have to be careful. Even though we think it's Jesus, we have proof with the New Testament, we still need to look at the evidence before that. We have to. So instead, we have allowed the Old Testament to build the requirements one piece at a time. Now, Isaiah is giving the silhouette another feature without our needing the New Testament to actually supply it. So the figure emerging from Isaiah must somehow be righteous and yet suffer, yet must somehow bear the wrongdoings of others without simply becoming another guilty person being punished for his own sins. His life becomes associated with an offering, and now he is somehow given by God in connection with covenant. These are no longer random characteristics scattered across unrelated ideas. They are beginning to gather around the servant. And there's another detail in Isaiah 42 that deserves attention. Immediately after saying the servant will be given for a covenant, Isaiah describes him as a light of the Gentiles, opening blind eyes and bringing prisoners out of darkness. The servant's covenant's work therefore appears to have restorative direction. The image moves toward light, freedom, and release. So Isaiah 49 expands the reach even further. The servant's mission is described as too great to concern only the restoration of Israel. God says he will make the servant a light to the nations so that his salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Well, whatever this covenant-associated servant is going to accomplish, the horizon appears larger than Israel alone. And that should get our attention here because the original covenant with Abraham had always contained a larger horizon. God's purpose involved blessing reaching beyond Abraham's immediate descendants to the families or nations of the earth. Isaiah's servant now appears within the larger movement, connecting covenant restoration with the mission extended outward to the nations. So the silhouette is becoming remarkably specific, but we will need to resist naming him just yet, even though I do. At this point in the investigation, we should be able to hand someone only the Old Testament evidence and ask what kind of worker would satisfy it. The person would need to explain a righteous servant who suffers, bears sins, gives his life, becomes associated with an offering, is given by God in connection with covenant, brings restoration, and carries God's salvation toward the nations. Then Jeremiah adds another requirement. The promised new covenant must somehow involve forgiveness, knowing God and God's law written within his people. Ezekiel adds cleansing, a new heart, a new spirit, and God's spirit within. Before Isaiah, the servant cannot merely establish another external religious system if the promised work is supposed to reach this deeply into humanity. Well, that brings us back to the question of blood. At Sinai, animals supplied the blood of the covenant. The animals were sacrificed, their blood applied, and the covenant relationship was formally established. Yet the people who received that blood eventually broke the covenant. So Isaiah now gives us a servant connected with covenant, whose own life is poured out unto death. Now, we should not say that the servant's blood is the blood of the new covenant because the Old Testament passages that we're examining do not explicitly make that statement. They don't. Making that connection belongs later when additional evidence allows us to test it, when we get to the New Testament. But we can certainly recognize that the pieces are moving unusually close together. Too close to where it can't be a coincidence anymore. Now, at Sinai, covenant and sacrificial blood meet. In Jeremiah, a new covenant is promised. In Isaiah, the servant is given for covenant. Elsewhere in Isaiah, that same servant gives his life and becomes associated with sacrifice. Well, the evidence has not yet completed the whole picture, but the outline is becoming difficult to ignore. This may be the strongest feature of Jesus' silhouette that we have encountered so far in this investigation, because the coming solution is beginning to look less like another ritual and more like a person, a servant. The servant of the Lord. Now, God does not merely promise something new. Isaiah repeatedly points towards someone whom God will give. Don't forget Abraham walking up the mountain with Isaac, getting ready to kill his own son. And the son asks, "Where's the ram?" Abraham says, "God will provide. God will give." So tonight, we must now place these pieces beside one another and ask whether covenant is the bridge connecting the life given by the servant with the life God promises to restore within his people. If it is, then the blood trail is approaching a major transition. Because we began with animals being brought to God, but the prophets are increasingly describing something God himself intends to give to humanity: a servant, a covenant, forgiveness, a new heart, and eventually his own spirit. So we've reached the point here where several trails that began separately are starting to converge. Exodus gave us blood establishing covenant. Isaiah gave us a righteous servant who suffers, bears sins, becomes associated with an offering, and pours out his life unto death. Doesn't sound like a rabbi to me. Jeremiah promised a new covenant involving forgiveness and God's law written within the heart. Ezekiel promised cleansing, a new heart, a new spirit, and God's spirit within his people. So the question now is whether these are separate promises or pieces of one larger work. Remember the Magi priests who saw the star of Bethlehem and then went and gave Jesus their possessions: gold, myrrh, and silver, and frankincense. Did you know that those Magi were witches, warlocks? Did you know that when they saw the star, they knew time was up? That their wicked practices was over because the Son is born? Did you know that they read their Bibles? Did you know that they understood Scripture better than Jesus' own people? And many scholars believe that they turned their ways and they worshiped Jesus and they stopped worshiping magic, black magic. This shows you how stiff-necked and hard-hardened the people were where Jesus came from. At Mount Sinai, the covenant was established with the blood of animals. Israel heard God's words, agreed to obey. Remember, I'm repeating myself because you need to remember this. Received the blood of the covenant. And then representatives of Israel entered God's presence and ate and drank. Yet the people eventually broke that covenant in 60 freaking days. The blood established the relationship, but it did not make the people permanently faithful to the relationship. And we learned last night that it was because of their hearts. Their hearts were hardened. Their hearts were broken. They were dry bones. As we've learned in the Old Testament, that dry bones are a broken spirit. A broken spirit is what we now call either schizophrenicism or MK Ultra, or splicing people up into different personalities to get them to do what you want. This is trauma bonding. To have a handler and to break a person's spirit down to where their own minds hide from the abuse and agony and pain, and another altar comes out. Well, the children of Israel were mostly altars because of living in Pharaoh. Pharaoh and Egypt understood black magic, and they were practicing their black magic on their people. They were experimenting just like America experimented through MK Ultra, creating black magic to split and make altars so that they will do what Pharaoh says. So you can look at it from God's point of view. How do I get these people fixed in their head? Because they've got altars. And bring them back to me. When all they known is violence and abuse or satanic ritual abuse. Philip says, broken spirit from many years of bondage? Quite possibly. It wouldn't take long, too. It would just take one generation. Ever since the 60s, the whole peace, love cult comes out and start practicing satanic ritual abuse without even realizing it. Free love, free sex, Make love, not war. Well, Timothy Leary, I think his name was saying there's documents. I can't say it proves it, but some say it does. You're going to have to do research on that. I don't have it, so I'm just going to say this is speculation. But Timothy Leary was working with the CIA in order to drug the American people, get us so drugged up that through drugs we split altars. You see, when you heavily drink and you black out, that's the fullest form of demonic possession you can ever see. Because the person leaves. Somebody else is there. You're talking to a demon. Same thing with drugs. Pharaoh understood alchemy. The Egyptians understood alchemy. And it wouldn't surprise me if they were drugging up the children of Israel. If you think trauma bonding and SRA, satanic ritual abuse, only started happening now in the 60s, you're out of your mind. It's been going on for 6,000 years. So Jeremiah therefore announces something different here. God will make a new covenant, and the defining features will reach inside the people themselves. God's law will be written upon their hearts, and they will know him. Their iniquity will be forgiven, and their sin will be remembered no more. So the problem that repeatedly appears inside the covenant will somehow be addressed within the covenant people. So then Isaiah introduces the servant and gives us an unexpected connection. God says he will give the servant for a covenant of the people. Well, Isaiah also describes this servant as righteous, suffering, bearing iniquity, associated with a guilt offering, and pouring out his life unto death. So we shouldn't connect those passages beyond what the Old Testament evidence allows, but we cannot ignore that sacrifice and covenant are beginning to gather around the same figure, the servant, the silhouette, Jesus. Philip says there is mass psychosis. I see it all the time. Absolutely, and we're getting it through our telephone, our cell phones. So this may be where the life given and the life restored begin moving toward each other. Isaiah shows us the servant giving his life, while Jeremiah and Ezekiel show us what God intends to accomplish within his restored people. So between those two sides stands covenant. One side involves a life being given, while the other involves people receiving forgiveness, cleansing, transformed hearts, and God's Spirit. So that possibility changes the way that we look back at Mount Sinai, as animal blood could participate in establishing the covenant God gave Israel, but the animal itself could not become the covenant. It could not write God's law upon the human heart. It could not cause someone to know God. It could not give a new spirit. It could not remove a heart of stone or place God's Spirit within someone or clean up and fix the altars that have been made from satanic ritual abuse. Yet Isaiah's language about the servant is different. God does not merely describe another animal or another ritual. He says he will give someone for a covenant of the people. So the coming solution is increasingly centered upon a person rather than simply another ceremony. And think about this. I have done deliverances on many people who were satanic ritually abused, and they've been healed. They've got Jesus. They're a new being. They're a new creature. They are happy. And all of those altars have been taken away by God because it wasn't them. And we got the real person back. We couldn't have done that without Jesus paying the atonement, is what I'm saying. Our hearts were way too hardened. We had to have the Holy Spirit inside of us to do such works. Now, this is where we need to preserve the silhouette without naming the worker. If we gather only the evidence that we have already discovered, we can begin describing what this coming figure must somehow accomplish. Well, he must be righteous, yet suffer. His suffering must somehow involve the sins of others. His life must be given. He must be associated with sacrifice. And now he must somehow be connected with covenant. Well, at the same time, the covenant associated with God's promised restoration must accomplish something the earlier arrangement did not permanently produce in Israel. So it must involve forgiveness, knowledge of God, inward transformation, and ultimately God's Spirit within his people. So the worker and the work are approaching each other. There's another detail worth noticing about the direction of God's action. At Mount Sinai, Israel brings animals to the altar, but in Isaiah, God says he will give the servant. So in Jeremiah, God says he will make the new covenant. God says he will write his law upon the heart. In Ezekiel, God says he will cleanse, give them a new heart, a new spirit, and put his spirit within his people. How else are you going to help the half-breeds that are out there right now, the Nephilim? I do believe there are Nephilim roaming today. We just don't recognize them. The direction is increasingly shifted from what humanity brings to God toward what God provides humanity. This is God also helping those half-breeds out there who have been bred with Nephilim blood, which has been recreated, I believe, because my research into the Philosopher's Stone is it is fossilized. Mainly, it talks about fossilized giant semen. Well, I'm sure they could take fossilized bone or semen, and I believe that had some significant power. But with that power, it was lineage, meaning their DNA had the rights, their blood had the rights to control mankind because mankind gave it to them through Adam and Eve. After the flood, they started finding the bones. And I believe that the more bones connected and collected by the dynasties, the more power they would get because they would use those bones and claim that's their ancestry. And then they could basically go to court and say, these are the bones of my forefathers. And then prove that, because if they're worshiping their forefathers, prove that, hey, they have, in a way you could say, have been adopted into the family of the fallen angels, and therefore they have the right to rule over us. And maybe that's how the dynasties are winning today. So understanding the entire blood story here, humanity brings sacrifices because God provided the sacrificial system. But the prophets eventually describe something humanity just cannot supply. Why? Because they may have Nephilim DNA. Not a lot, but some. Humanity cannot manufacture the righteous servant. Humanity cannot write God's law upon its own heart in the way Jeremiah promises. Humanity cannot place God's spirit within himself. The final restoration must come from God, period. Now, this doesn't erase human response. Israel was still called to repent, return, obey, and love God. We established that already last night, and we don't need to reopen it. But the important point here is that the promised solution exceeds what human religious performance can produce. Perhaps covenant is therefore becoming the bridge between two movements. One side, a life is given. The other side, life with God is restored. So the servant stands strangely close to the first side because he pours out his life, and strangely close to the second because God calls him a covenant. Now, we shouldn't claim that yet because we haven't proven exactly how the servant's death establishes Jeremiah's new covenant. As the Old Testament evidence has brought the pieces together, but it still hasn't given us every connection explicitly. But that distinction is important because we're trying to follow the evidence rather than read the ending backwards from the beginning. So we can say that the silhouette is becoming remarkably specific, and somewhere in the promised future stands a righteous servant who gives his life, bears sin, is associated with sacrifice, and is given by God for covenant. So somewhere in that same promised future stands forgiveness, inward transformation, restored knowledge of God, cleansing, and God's spirit within his people. So the question is no longer whether these themes exist. They clearly do. The question is how they connect. And that's exactly where we're going to leave this. We begin with the blood of the animals at Sinai and discovered that covenant blood led toward fellowship in God's presence. We then watched Israel break that covenant despite everything God had given them. Jeremiah responds with the promise of a new covenant, and Isaiah unexpectedly placed a mysterious servant directly in the covenant trail. So the silhouette now has enough features that we should be able to recognize the worker when Scripture finally identifies him. But we are not ready to turn on the light just yet, even though I've snuck the name in many times. There is still another major piece of the Old Testament blood trail to investigate. And before God's presence could remain among his people, Israel, cleansing mattered first. And Ezekiel later promises cleansing immediately before promising God's Spirit within his people. So if the new covenant ultimately moves God's presence closer rather than further away, then we need to understand what must be cleansed and why blood repeatedly appears in that process. And that's where tomorrow we're going to go in part 15. Covenant has brought the life given and the life restored close together, but cleansing may explain how the distance between a holy God and sinful humanity can actually be crossed. If the servant is somehow involved in that cleansing, then the silhouette will become sharper still before we ever speak his name. Cool. So what did we learn today? Well, today we learned that covenant begins with God's initiative, with him. First, he pulled Israel out before he even gave them a way of living, before he gave them a religion. Israel did not earn its rescue by keeping the law. God delivered them from Egypt first, carried them through the wilderness, and told them that he had brought them to himself. Only afterward did he call them into covenant obedience. Now, the destination of the Exodus was therefore more than just freedom from Pharaoh. It was relationship with God. It was kind of a big deal. The biggest deal that any bloodline could ever receive on earth at that time. At Sinai, that covenant relationship was formally established with blood. Moses placed blood upon the altar and then upon the people, declaring it the blood of the covenant. We already knew that Scripture connects blood with life, but tonight showed us something new. Blood appears at the moment God formally binds his rescued people to himself. Then Exodus gives us an extraordinary sequence. After the covenant blood is applied, Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders ascend the mountain up at Mount Sinai. They encounter God's presence and they eat and drink before him. With him, right there. In front of him. We cannot claim that the blood explicitly caused this access because Exodus does not say that. But we cannot ignore the sequence either. Sacrifice, blood, covenant, God's presence, and fellowship appear together. And this showed us that death was not the destination of the covenant ceremony. The animals died, but the people approached God alive. Blood was shed, but the story moved forward and toward fellowship. And once again, the blood trail passed through death while continuing toward life with God. Yet Israel broke the covenant almost immediately, 60 days. Right after they all agreed, sent their elders up to the mountain, literally 73 people stood before God. That was enough evidence to go back down to the 1 to 2 million people down there and say, dude, he's real. And the golden calf revealed something. Covenant blood had not changed. Israel could receive the blood, hear God's words, promise obedience, and still turn away, which they did. And later generations could possess sacrifices, priests, commandments, and the temple while their hearts remained unfaithful. But the problem was not simply a shortage of religious activity. As Jeremiah therefore promised something different. God would make a new covenant, not merely add more sacrifices or commandments. His law would be written within the people, in their hearts, in his people. They would know him and their sins would be forgiven. Well, last night we already established the heart problem. Well, tonight showed us why that problem becomes central to the new covenant. Then Isaiah gives us the most important new piece of today's investigation. God says he will give his servant for a covenant of the people. And this is the same prophetic servant that we previously encountered suffering, bearing sin, becoming associated with the guilt offering, and pouring out his life unto death. The servant connected with sacrifice is now also connected with covenant. Well, that sharpened the silhouette considerably. The Old Testament is beginning to describe a worker who must somehow be righteous, suffer, bear sins, give his life, be associated with sacrifice, and be connected with covenant. Meanwhile, the promised covenant must somehow result in forgiveness, restored relationship, transformed hearts, and ultimately God's Spirit within his people. So the direction of the story also becomes clearer. At Mount Sinai, humanity brought animals to the altar, but Isaiah says God will give the servant. Jeremiah says God will make the new covenant and write his law upon the heart. Ezekiel says God will cleanse his people, give them a new heart and spirit, and place his spirit within them. The promised restoration increasingly moves from what humanity brings to God toward what God gives humanity. And if you followed this series all the way up until now, there's no denying the evidence. Sorry. Not sorry. The Father in heaven is so holy. He's so powerful. The only way was to do it this way. I believe the blood and the plasma, there's a connection to fourth and third dimensions. A fourth dimensional being coming into the third is not going to look like what it looks like in their own dimension. And the power that comes so that it can be present in this dimension is a power beyond anything we could ever understand. And this is how it had to be in order for God to get closer to his people. And he initiated it, not them. It was his choice, not theirs. And perhaps the greatest thing that we learned today is that covenant may be the bridge between the life being given and the life being restored. Ow, wow, 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 wow. Isaiah shows us the servant giving his life. Jeremiah and Ezekiel shows us God restoring his people from within. Between those two realities stand the promise of covenant, and Isaiah places the servant directly inside that covenant story. The silhouette we've talked about, or Jesus Christ, who comes to fulfill all of this stuff. The servant becomes all of the sacrifices and laws that they had to do. And we still haven't even named the worker because the Old Testament is still constructing his silhouette. But the outline is becoming increasingly difficult to miss, wouldn't you say? Blood, sacrifice, covenant, forgiveness, life, God's presence, and the mysterious servant are no longer separate trails. They all are beginning to converge upon the same destination. Proof that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. Written about through many prophets, written about through the children of Israel and what they went through, and how they got close to God, and what God did for them. Even when they disobeyed, he sent his own begotten Son. So tomorrow we need to investigate the next missing piece, which is cleansing. If covenant is bringing God and humanity back together, and if God's ultimate promise is to place his spirit within his people, well, what must happen before a holy God's presence can dwell within sinful humanity? Well, that question may bring the silhouette into an even sharper focus. So questions for next episode. If the covenant is the bridge between the life that is given and the life God intends to restore, then the next question is what makes that restored relationship possible? God is holy, humanity is sinful, and yet Ezekiel promises that God's own spirit will eventually dwell within his people. Well, what has to happen before God's presence can move that close? Remember, he's all-powerful, all-knowing. And why does cleansing appear so often in the blood story? On the Day of Atonement, blood was used in connection with cleansing the sanctuary, the altar, and the holy places because Israel's uncleanness had affected the place where God dwelt among them. Was cleansing simply ceremonial, or was it revealing a much larger problem involving sin and God's presence? Oh, and also, the Aztecs were practicing the same thing that the Egyptians were practicing, which they were cutting off heads. for their sun gods. And they were drawing the breath from the blood there. That's how the devil uses blood. The breath. Life. The spark of life. The breath. God breathes in, and as you breathe out, it's supposed to go directly back to God in communion. But somehow the devil has been able to steal the exhale and steal the spark of life from us a shard at a time. A little bit pieces, like little pieces of sand here and there. If the sanctuary had to be cleansed, God dwelt there, what should we make of Ezekiel 36 then? God promises to sprinkle clean water upon his people. Clean. Cleanse them from their uncleanness and idols, give them a new heart and spirit, and then place a spirit within them. Well, is the order significant, or does cleansing prepare the way for God's presence? And if so, are we seeing another part of the sanctuary pattern that moves toward the human being? Well, we should not yet claim that Ezekiel explicitly calls the individual person's God's temple, because it does not. But why does the prophet place cleansing immediately before the promise of God's Spirit within? Could the sanctuary have been showing us something about the greater restoration God intended all along? Well, the silhouette, guys, is almost complete. Tomorrow we'll add cleansing to it, and part 16 after, we'll ask whether the Old Testament itself has already shown us why the final answer could never simply be another animal.
This has been Cause Before Symptom with your host, James Carner. Go to his website, jamescarner.com, and sign up for his newsletter. Also, download his free books, The Breath War, The Ritual Machine, The Crown of Blood, The Stone That Speaks, and The Crown of Cain. Oh, and one more thing. If you could just try and love your neighbor, we believe the world would be a better place. See you tomorrow.